Welcome to the Training Grounds podcast. My name is Katie. I am your host. I have been a barista for 8 years. I work in education and training as well. I've developed drinks that have been sold nationwide, and I have a passion for coffee history, which is why we are here today. This is episode number 2, and before we get started on episode 2, I would like to introduce a segment that I'm going to be calling Things I Forgore Skull Emoji. This is just an opportunity for me to either correct or add information from a previous episode. So last episode 1, was the history of coffee. And in that episode, during the section on the 14 families of El Salvador, the La Matanza, the massacre, I erroneously said 300,000 deaths. It was 30,000 deaths, which was still 4% of the indigenous population, which is just still an absolute tragedy. But I did want to give some insight onto kind of how I do the research for these things. I first write it in a notebook, and then I write it in a training document, and then of course I record the episode off of the training document. And I went back and I looked, and the training document says 30,000, so I'm just a fucking idiot, and I don't know why I do the research if I'm just gonna say the wrong thing anyway. I do want to say that it is correct on the training document, so if you are going to be using that to spread information, you can, rest easy knowing that that is correct. I am just the dumbest girl in school. Also, I wanted to take a moment and talk about something that has just been really on my mind recently, and that is that it is a privilege to have a written history. Just because something wasn't written down doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And in a lot of cases, things were written down, but during the course of, unfortunate human events, things get lost and destroyed, and stories get lost to time. So just because I didn't say something in this doesn't mean that it didn't happen. I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of all of coffee history. I am just a girl with a theater degree. So please stay curious and just know that everything that we are talking about, we're only talking about because we were able to preserve that history and those stories. And so with that, we can start episode number 2. In this episode, we will be talking about coffee shops and revolution. Now, we're not going to just be talking about actual revolution, but we will be talking about that. We're also going to be talking about a revolution of ideas and revolutions within just society. I guess the only way to get started is to get started. And so that brings us to the Ottoman Empire. The first coffee house popped up around 1550 in Istanbul, the modern coffee shop, sort of how we know it today. From the beginning, coffee houses were a really unique space for their time. Men of every social class could gather there, and any man could enter as long as he could afford a drink. It is important to mention that in Istanbul, at least, women were prohibited from these spaces. They weren't allowed to participate. Just something to keep in mind. And because of this gathering space, illiterate men could learn from scholars, members of the court could talk to the Sultan's elite infantry unit known as janissaries. We'll get to them in a second. And these groups that were sort of once pitted against each other found themselves on common ground for the first time. There's some really great research done by Dr. Sarah Jelani, and she said that coffee houses introduced people to rebellion, self-determination, and the fallibility of power. And I think that that's really, really powerful, that these spaces provided a place for people who come to the realization that power is not absolute. When we talk to one another, things are revealed to us. It's sort of like how when you're able to talk about your compensation with other coworkers, sometimes you learn a lot of information and maybe your opinion changes. And this whole idea of people getting together and realizing that this power is fallible, it comes up frequently throughout history. We were really pulled away from our naturally collaborative nature by those with power that wanted to maintain that power at all costs. So by 1600, there were an estimated 600 coffee houses in Istanbul. 1622, Sultan Osman II is assassinated by his infantry known as janissaries. Now, Why did they assassinate him, you may ask? Well, he had tried to stop them from going to coffee houses, so they strangled him. That's the end of the sentence. That's just what they did. And ironically, his concern was warranted because the strangulation in question was planned at a coffee house. In 1633, Sultan Murad III, the brother of Osman II, who was strangled, made drinking coffee a capital offense. So, literally drinking coffee was punishable by death. And in order to enforce this, he would go around the city in disguise and behead coffee drinkers with his broadsword. The distrust of the coffee house itself would endure for centuries, with sultans watching the coffee houses closely until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1922. Now, interestingly, there was conflicting opinion on whether Islam allowed the drinking of coffee, because it is an alcoholic, but some considered it, to be a mind-altering substance in a way because of the caffeine. So there were coffee bans put in place and taken away when things were getting too crazy. Despite this, 3 revolutions against the Ottomans can be traced back to coffee houses. And that's going to include revolutions that resulted in the establishment of an independent Greece in 1821, Serbia in 1835, and Bulgaria in 1878. And, just as they feared, the egalitarian nature of coffee houses spread across the world and led to more equitable forms of government. Now, get in your time machines now with me, if you will. Strap on in. That was your seatbelt strapping in. And we're just going to vroom vroom all the way to 1600s England. Now, in the 1600s in England, education was really only accessible to the wealthy. So wealthy families, they would send their kids to these elite king's schools, or of course they would pay a ton of money for private tutors. And without wealth, you were kind of screwed. You had to either be exceptionally smart or exceptionally lucky, or some combination of both, in order to get an education in England at the time. And regardless of that, even if you somehow did manage to get an education, most people's education ended in adulthood. There were only 2 universities in England at the time, and that was Oxford and Cambridge. I am sure you are familiar with those words. They had fees outside of the annual income of most people. And then on top of that tuition, obviously, you still had to pay room, board, buy books, and this meant that higher education was out of reach for a majority of the population. So the first coffee house in England actually opened in Oxford in 1650. Now, it served almost exclusively university members. It wasn't like a club. It wasn't only people that were university members could enter, but just based on proximity, it ended up being sort of the hot spot for disillusioned academics to congregate. And it set this precedent that coffee houses were a place for debate and academia and an exchange of ideas that existed outside of the normal channels of education. And this is something that would be copy and pasted throughout history all across the world. But of course, there wasn't just that one coffee house in Oxford. In 1652, about 2 years later, Pasqua Rosé, who was a Greek servant to the coffee-loving merchant Daniel Edwards, opened London's first coffee shop. It started as a shack against the walls of St. Michael's Churchyard, and I love reading about old-timey England because the description of this is in what was described as a labyrinth of alleys off of Cornhill. Like, girl, what? It was a shack in an alley. Let's not get it twisted. So Edward had become tired of hosting guests at his estate, and honestly, I can fully relate to that. I don't want people in my home either. And because that coffee shack that his servant has was so close to the Royal Exchange, which was the center of commerce in London, it became the go-to hub for London's merchants to congregate. And so within a few years, Pasqua was able to upgrade from a shack to a shop across the alley. I do want to make a point to let you know that the coffee sucked. It was real bad, you guys. I mean, to be totally fair, it wasn't even close to what we are used to today. The beans were usually stale. They were often dry or or over-roasted, and sometimes they even contained bits of bugs. And because of this, Pasquale wasn't popular because he was selling the best cup of coffee in London. He was popular because all of these merchants knew that they could find this dude, Michael, who the fuck? He was popular because all of the merchants knew that they could find Daniel Edwards there, and they were attracted to the stimulating effects of coffee and the conversation. And this gave way to the practice of businessmen conducting business in coffee shops. So what they would do is they would let their clients know what cafes they could be found at. And maybe in the most popular instance of this would be Lloyd's Coffee House. And this was a hot spot for ship captains and merchants to gather and share and hear the latest business news. Lloyd, Mr. Lloyd, of course, he wasn't an idiot. He was listening to all of this stuff that his clientele were saying. And because these are businessmen, in order to cater to his clientele, he started taking all of that information and publishing it in a newsletter. That newsletter became so popular that he actually made more money off of that than he did the shop. And soon, insurance brokers realized that Lloyd's would be a really good place to be because there's all these captains and ship owners. And so these insurance brokers would rent out booths and conduct their business in this cafe. And eventually, this turned into what I am assuming is a well-known English insurance company, Lloyd's of London. Now, of course, insurance wasn't the only thing swayed. Finance was also swayed by the culture of the coffee house. The London Stock Exchange was started in Jonathan's coffee house. After being banned from the Royal Exchange for being too rowdy, a group of stockbrokers moved to Jonathan's. I find that so funny that they were banned from the Royal Exchange for being too rowdy, especially just considering what we know now about Wall Street traders of the 70s and 80s and how coke and drug fueled and how insane all of that was. I don't know if you've seen that clip of, I think it's Robert Downey Jr. visiting Wall Street and just being gagged by how these people are behaving. So I like to think that back in the 1600s, some guys were doing something similar, or I like to think that they just slightly raised their voice and immediately the Royal Exchange was like, get out. So anyway, Jonathan Casting, he began making a list of commodities and provisions and exchange rates, and he would publish that a few days a week for a few days at a time. And because he did that, these stockbrokers were able to hold auctions there. These people were leveraging their coffee house and the conversation and the culture that would just gravitate towards it. They would leverage that to advance another goal. And also, I'm sure, to maintain their clientele. These people weren't stupid. They knew that they had to keep people coming back because the coffee wasn't good enough for that. There had to be something else involved. Literature and art were also swayed by the opinions of the coffee house. For instance, Will's Coffee House was also known as the Wits Coffee House, and it was a favorite of some of the most famous writers in England, as well as people that just, wanted to rub elbows with their literary heroes. I'm gonna be super duper honest with you guys. I'm gonna say these names later for you of these famous writers. I've not heard a single one of their names, except for one guy, because his last name is Swift. And of course, in these intellectual spaces, there were always dueling opinions of the quality of the content of discussion. So while Will's was a favorite of John Dryden, Jonathan Swift said he found at Will's, and I quote, the worst conversation he ever heard in his life, end quote. However, Button's Coffee House did get the approval of Swift. And Buttons is actually kind of a really interesting example, in my opinion. They were known for having a letterbox out front that was shaped like a lion's head. People were encouraged to submit their lampoons and their satirical papers, and those would end up being published, and they would also publish reviews and critiques of literature and live theater. And sometimes careers would be made or broke in these coffee houses from these reviews. And this practice gave way to the modern literary criticism and review that we are familiar with today. The one that I find absolutely horrifying, though, is how science was influenced by coffee house culture. And I don't mean like food science. I mean, they were doing medical experiments in cafes for the public to gather and watch. At this time, there were a lot of prerequisites for scientific involvement, and a defecting group left the Royal Society. They began meeting at this cafe called Tilliard. billiards and other similar cafes where they could perform experiments for the public to observe. And in one such event, Isaac Newton dissected a dolphin on the cafe tables. I'm just gonna say that one more time for you, just so you don't have to buffer back. He dissected a dolphin on the cafe tables. And I have so many questions. Did the barista have to clean that up? Or do you think Isaac was one of those guys that was no, we're gonna do this right, we're gonna clean it up, we have mad respect for billiards. What would you do if someone started dissecting a dolphin on the table of your cafe in the year of our Lord 2024? I'd love to know. I would call the police. So naturally, the introduction of coffee into the social scene caused a huge shift in social norms of the time. British culture was hyper hierarchical at that time. Just to sort of give you a marker, this was a period of time that's about 40 years after Shakespeare wrote some of his most famous works. So we can take a lot from his plays when we're trying to understand how society worked back then. Coffee shops provided a space where every man, which in the case of London in England, women could also be owners and barmaids. This was similar in Colonial America, which we're about to get to. And regardless of the social status of these men, they could come together and flip through the same newspapers and pamphlets and share their thoughts in real time. And when these barriers between classes began to break down from the exchange of ideas, that divide between the upper and lower classes began to shrink, and it gave way to this more middle class. The space also gave way to penny universities, which is a name for simply just how these cafes operated, all of the exchange of ideas that was going on, because for the cost of a cup of coffee, which was a penny, anyone could be let in on the spirited debate and readings. And the academic elite were very dismissive of penny universities. There were no rules, there was no moderator, and they thought that no real conversation could be held in the amount of time that it took to drink a cup of coffee. Because you have to understand, people were discussing everything from literature to chemistry, astronomy, and art, all in the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. However, this method, free from any strict parameters and encouraging this sort of thinking outside of the box, leads to innovations in education and beyond. And, of course, with all of those innovations elsewhere, innovations were also going to start happening in political thinking. So Charles II's father, Charles I, was beheaded during the English Civil War, so he was pretty paranoid of dissent, and coffee houses had made politics part of the public's conversation, which had never been up for consideration by them. I also think it's just so interesting that coffee and beheading are very weirdly linked in history, but only because the people in power were oh damn, this person that I was related to got beheaded. You know what the reason was for that? It was those goddamn coffee shops. I mean, the mental gymnastics are just gold medal level. I love to see it. But because this opened up the conversation to the general public, in June of 1672, King Charles issued a proclamation to restrain the spreading of false news and licentious talking of matters of state and government. So literally, King Charles said fake news, and I think that is so hilarious. And it read in part, quote, "Men have assumed to themselves a liberty." Oh, wait, hold on. Wait, should I do this in a British accent? Hold on, let me use my theater degree, you guys. It read in part, "Men have assumed to themselves a liberty, not only in coffee houses, but in other places and meetings, both public and private, to censure and defame the proceedings of state by speaking evil of things they understand not." The ban lasted 11 days. Also, because I do love to continue in tradition, King Charles II, guys, I can't wait until this becomes a video podcast, because then I can just show a picture of him on the screen. I will add this on an Instagram Reels with his picture, but you guys go Google him right now, pull up his image, because I wrote so many jokes and I'm going to tell you all of them. It looks like he's wearing a very clockable Party City wig, it's giving Shake and Go. It's giving Weird Al Yankovic. He looks like he's trying to prove something next to the women of the time. Next to the women of the time, he fucking cooks. This man's hair, he cooks. It looks like he's about to tell me that that he is Inigo Montoya and that I killed his father and I should prepare to die. And I'm going to tell my kids this was Captain Hook. You're going to just strap on and back into your time machines for me. And if you want to go ahead and just zoom to Colonial America. John Smith is credited with introducing coffee to the New World. Many of the first settlers came with a mortar and a pestle for making coffee powder, and coffee was consumed very similarly to the coffee ceremonies in Romeo. They would roast the green beans on a pan, and then they would grind them with a mortar and pestle and boil them. My next episode is going to be the history of coffee in America. We are going to go all the way from the introduction of coffee to America in colonial US, all the way to present day. So if you want to hear more about this, which honestly you really do, because there are some super interesting and just juicy stories. So keep an eye out for that one. It will be coming out eventually. As is my usual release schedule. I'm very great at keeping on the whenever schedule. But because I am going to cover it more in depth very soon, I'm really just going to give you guys the highlights, and we will talk more specifically about everything in that episode. Coffee houses in the colonies popped up in 1670. Dorothy Jones became the first licensed coffee trader in the colonies, and she sold coffee at her tavern, the Green Dragon, in Boston, which would soon become known as the headquarters of the Revolution. The Sons of Liberty would have secret meetings there, and the Boston Tea Party was likely planned in part in the Green Dragon, and it's said that people met there before and rallied there after. It is said that Benjamin Franklin was very fond of coffee houses because he spent plenty of time over in London and in France, and he drafted the Declaration of Independence in American coffee houses. At City Tavern in Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence was first read out loud to the public, and in the words of John Adams himself, the debate and deliberations in Congress are impenetrable secrets. The chat of the coffee house are free and open. So we all know that England ends up taxing America up the ass, and perhaps one of the most consequential were the Townshend Acts of 1767. Now, these acts forced colonists to pay taxes on British goods like tea, oil, lead, and paint. In response, the colonies boycotted British goods, giving birth to the phrase "no taxation without representation." When the Townshend Acts were repealed, they left the one on tea in place because they believed that it was the one thing that the colonies couldn't live without. And because of this, it would allow them to continue asserting that they had a right to tax the colonies, representation or not. And in response to this, from 1770 to 1773, coffee was drank as a protest to the tax. I love how Americans, we just haven't changed, you know? Classic America, 10 out of 10. Love to see it. Those that couldn't live without their tea were able to get around the British tea tax by buying tea that was smuggled in by the Dutch. But generally, the drinking of tea was seen as an act of fealty to Britain. And if you want to hear more about all of this and future and present, well, I guess really more just like, you know, coffee in America, listen to the next episode is what I'm trying to say, and I sound really stupid. Okay, once again, get in your time machine, strap on in, click, click, and we are going to swoopity swoop ourselves to France in about mid to late 1600s. So coffee arrived in France in 1669 as a gift to King Louis XIV. And in one century, this humble plant would instigate the downfall of King Louis XVI. But before then, in 1689, Francois Procopio obtains a lemonade salesman license, and soon extravagant decor and trying out the newest brewing methods became the modus operandi of Parisian cafes. However, along with this commitment to coffee experimentation, it took on that sort of egalitarian nature. However, unlike Istanbul, cafes were a bit more separate in terms of clientele. So while many cafes catered to the working class, in the lead up to the revolution have made these divides even clearer. The upper class, like the Procope, it was known as the unofficial assembly room of the Enlightenment, and it was often filled with great scholars of the time. I mean, these are just, it reads as a list of all-time hits from AP Euro. You got Voltaire, Rousseau, John Locke, Descartes. This is where philosophy and the ideas of the Enlightenment would form. more. I also do want to say that the Enlightenment is mostly based off of a lot of Islamic teachings. In terms of thoughts, it's not exactly novel. However, it was a new way of thinking for the Western world. The Dutch cafe was frequented by Jacobins, and they were the far-left revolutionaries of the time, and they were very much against the idea of monarchy. The Café de Valois, I took 2 years of French in high school. Don't think it's stuck. Café de Valois was the spot of the Feuillants. Basically, they were the opposite side of the political spectrum to the Jacobins. They wanted to preserve the monarchy, and they believed that monarchs were anointed by God. So that's a really fun point of view. The royal drummer was for the low-class, sort of rowdy crowds, and the Café Caveau was simply known for being kind of just quiet. Now, we may think that we've reached the height of cafe culture in present day. You know, what more could it possibly be? But it really does not come close to comparing the cafe culture of France in that mid to late 18th century. For example, in Paris alone, there was an estimated 2,000 cafes by the end of the 1700s, and by 1880, it's estimated that there were 45,000 cafes in Paris alone. So for comparison, in 2023, there was an estimated 4,000 coffee shops in New York City. That's just baffling to me. In a world where we feel like we have a coffee shop on every corner, I can't imagine being in 1880 Paris where there was 45,000 cafes. That's absolutely bonkers to me. France, they had a free press, but it was considerably underdeveloped in comparison to its peers. The first French newspaper didn't even exist until 1777, and with this lack of printed material, along with half of the population being, illiterate, made it necessary for people to communicate in other ways. And by no means did that mean that people were uninformed because they didn't have newspapers, but it was a time that gave rise to the orator. And this is men that would take the info and filter it through their own views and speak with very fiery rhetoric and intense words. And nightly, men would take turns speaking and reading aloud writings on current affairs. And these men would draw crowds of supporters and command the room. And cafes became the main source of information, or at least a main source of information. And the exchange of ideas was aided by the energizing nature of coffee. You have to understand, in colonial America, in England, in France, alcohol was typically considered the beverage of choice. Usually alcohol was safer to drink than the water. And because of this meant that a lot of the times people were just kind of like walking around a little bit drunk all the time. And when coffee came on the scene, first of all, you have to boil the water to drink coffee. So it makes it safer than drinking just regular old water. And caffeine. Caffeine is a drug. Caffeine is stimulating. I can't imagine people that have never experienced that before, how game-changing that must have been. And so, of course, intellectuals flocked to coffee houses instead because they knew that the people around them would also be of the mind to hear what they had to say because they were sober, or at least high on caffeine. The cafes provided the 18th century Parisian with a central place to discuss the government. Remember how King Charles didn't super duper love that over in England? Same in France. Kind of crazy how that works. It's almost like people in power just don't want other people to talk about that. That's crazy. Until the later part of the 18th century, how the government operated was entirely opaque. So opaque that even some in the government didn't know what was going on. The king's secret refers to secret diplomatic channels used by King Louis XV to do things that often advanced his own interests, usually at odds with official policy. Naturally, it was intended that citizens not know what it took to govern. They didn't want anyone to know what was going on behind the scenes because it's obviously just a big old fun smokescreen for a whole ton of shitty corruption. But if we claim that we were anointed by God and that other people don't know what they're talking about because they are not as holy, well then, gee willikers, my friend, that sure does shut them up, doesn't it? Now, although there were cafes all over Paris, they were particularly concentrated in the Palais Royal. This was a district in the center of Paris, and it was a courtyard made up of various buildings owned by by a royal, but it was open to the public. It was home to 25 cafes, and this is where the French Revolution would be born. Before tensions began to rise in 1789, public opinion was already turning sharply against the king. And while July 14th, 1789 marks the official start of the French Revolution, the catalyst was very much intertwined with the cafes and their way of delivering information with fiery rhetoric. And in June of that year, tensions were at an all-time high. One more nudge would push things over the edge, and that nudge came on July 11th when the Comptroller General of Finances was dismissed. This enraged the public because as the comptroller, he worked to make information on royal spending available to the public. People were unaware until the next day, which is actually really funny because the information got out right away, but people didn't believe the person that told them, and they called him an aristocrat, which is just a really sick 18th century France burn. The next day in the Palais Royal, a young journalist, Camille Desmoulins, he ran from the Café de Foy where he heard the information, and he leapt on a table and brandished his sword, showed a pistol, and shouted a call to arms, which is so funny because they call it a cockade, and I'm just gonna leave that where it is. After this, they pulled leaves off of the trees and they put them in their hats, and 1,000 people marched on to revolution. You know, it's like that Coco Chanel quote, before you leave to start a revolution, add a little bit of an accessory. Now, I do want to just let y'all know here, though, that in the same conversations that the French were plotting a revolution and their own freedom, they were in the same breath, in the same conversations, trading slaves. So I don't want to, by any means, whitewash history. They weren't fighting for the freedom of everyone. So what's the takeaway here? Honestly, I think it's really quite as simple as governments fall, but coffee houses endure. All of the mentioned places still have a thriving cafe culture to this day. And it might look much different, but the egalitarian nature of the spaces is still very similar. It seems that across centuries, across rulers, across everything, people just want to connect. I think it's important to look at the very reality of where would we be without spaces like this in history. I mean, the Enlightenment, it has its roots in Islam, and because of coffee houses, it got the chance to enter the Western world. And it gave us ideas like the separation of church and state, tolerance, personal liberty, and so much more. America and all of these places would look so much different if it wasn't for the space that coffee houses provided. And so the next time you're in your coffee shop, keep in mind that it isn't something that we should be gatekeeping. We should never, as baristas, be prejudging people and deciding that they don't belong in our space. None of us get to decide who is worthy of being in a space. And we especially shouldn't be judging people for their choice of beverage or the way that they drink their coffee, anything like that. And I mean, sometimes there are exceptions. There's exceptions to everything. However, I think that if we can offer up these places once again the way they should be offered up, I don't know, maybe this is exactly what we need right now, these spaces. It seems like they've been really helpful throughout history. So I don't know, keep that in mind. And that is the second episode of the Training Grounds podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you have not yet, please go follow us at Training Grounds Podcast on Instagram. You can also go to traininggroundspodcast.com for the training document that goes along with this episode, as well as the source document. I encourage you to always stay curious, look at those sources, see what it has to say, and if you find anything that I may have gotten wrong, which, as we discussed in the beginning part of this episode, is a very real possibility, you are always welcome to email traininggroundspod@gmail.com with anything that you'd like to let me know. And I hope to teach you a little bit more in the next episode, where we will discuss the history of coffee in the United States of America. Take care, guys. bye.